Alright, so let's take a look at this freeze plug, which is leaking. Let's see if we can zoom in here. Yep, there's definitely a hole in that freeze plug right there. You can see the coolant trail that it left on the block, that telltale sign. And there's a rust hole right in the freeze plug. Alright, now that we have the old freeze plug out, you can see on the backside how corroded these things get. They just corrode away, especially if you do not service your cooling system properly, or if you're just running water in that thing instead of antifreeze coolant. So it's a good idea when you have one freeze plug like this that starts leaking to replace all of them, because all of them have been in the vehicle the same amount of time. They're all subject to the same corrosive forces. And most manufacturers will put these steel, which makes them subject to this kind of corrosion. If you're going to replace any freeze plugs, I do recommend that if all possible, you put the brass freeze plugs in. They won't be subject to the same kind of corrosion. They'll last a lot longer. They'll do better. I imagine that the manufacturers only put these steel ones in because they're cheaper, and the brass is more expensive. So we're going to go ahead and install this brass freeze plug now. So when we put this thing in, we want to put this thing in evenly into the bore and tap around across this way and this way, this way and this way, so that this goes evenly within the bore. What we don't want to do is shove this thing in so that one edge dips in. We want this thing to go in as squarely as possible. So get it started, just a series of small taps, and then try to get something like a socket that can fit squarely on this thing. And then strike the socket nice and square. So try to drive it in square so that you don't end up with a problem with this thing tilting or canting in its bore. So I'm going to get some wet and dry sandpaper, probably 220 grit, and clean the surfaces up. I usually try to use a piece of 220 wet and dry sandpaper, but I'm out of the wet and dry, so I've got this old auto body sandpaper. It's 220. I'm just going to try to clean it up a little bit. So I like to use just a very, very light, thin smear of silicone or a gasket maker of some type, just to help me put this in and to fill any small imperfections that may be there. Alright, it's finally pressing into place. I just have to drive it more deeply now. It's just a really bad angle, and that's typical of trying to change freeze plugs in a position like this. The angle is never going to be correct. I'm going to try a different tactic. See if I can use an impact universal. See if I can drive some force on this thing a little bit more squarely over a wider area. Okay, it's going in. This tactic seems to be working better with the universal. It's a 1/2 inch universal impact. Just so I can get an angle.